My name is Dino. I am 36 years old. Exactly 20 years ago, my parents threw me out into a freezing rainstorm with a newborn baby in my arms. That night changed everything. I was 16, terrified, holding a child my girlfriend had just abandoned on my doorstep. Instead of helping me, my father looked at me with pure disgust and said, "Give the baby to the state. You will ruin your brother's future." When I refused, they laughed. My mother packed my bags. My father opened the front door, pointed into the dark, and told me my life was officially over. They humiliated me in front of my older brother Julian, who just sat there, smirking, like I was a stray dog they were finally kicking out. But here's the thing they didn't know. They didn't know about my grandmother. They didn't know about the inheritance she was quietly building for 20 years. And they certainly didn't know that the terrified teenage boy they threw out would become the very thing they would face in a courtroom 2 decades later. Now, those same people who discarded me like garbage are sweating, stuttering, and begging for a mercy they never showed me. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their entire world, hit that like button if you believe in justice and karma. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single message. Now, let's go back to the night my life shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I was 16, a junior in a well-funded suburban high school. My biggest worries were supposed to be passing algebra, surviving the cafeteria hierarchy, and getting a part-time job to buy a used car. We lived in a 2-story colonial house with a perfectly manicured lawn, in an upscale neighborhood governed by a strict homeowners association. My parents cared more about what the neighbors thought of their flower beds than what was going on inside my head. But instead of worrying about algebra, my entire reality collapsed on a Tuesday evening in late October. The doorbell rang just as the sun was setting. I opened it to find my girlfriend, Sarah. She was pale, physically shaking, clutching a bundle of thick hospital blankets to her chest. We had hidden her pregnancy out of pure terror. We were stupid, scared kids living in a community that didn't tolerate mistakes. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, handed the heavy bundle to me, and said she couldn't do this. Her parents were sending her away to live with her aunt in another state. She turned around, walked down the driveway, and got into a waiting car. I never saw her again. I stood in my own hallway for what felt like an eternity, holding a tiny, fragile human being. Noah. He was so incredibly small, his little chest rising and falling against my arms. I could smell baby powder and rain. I walked slowly into the living room where my parents, Arthur and Eleanor, were relaxing. My father was reading a golf magazine. My mother was watching a home improvement show. My older brother Julian was lounging in the armchair, scrolling through his phone. Julian was the undisputed golden child, varsity quarterback, honor roll student, destined for an Ivy League university. I was 16, a junior in a well-funded suburban high school. My biggest worries were supposed to be passing algebra, surviving the cafeteria hierarchy, and getting a part-time job to buy a used car. We lived in a 2-story colonial house with a perfectly manicured lawn, in an upscale neighborhood governed by a strict homeowners association. My parents cared more about what the neighbors thought of their flower beds than what was going on inside my head. But instead of worrying about algebra, my entire reality collapsed on a Tuesday evening in late October. The doorbell rang just as the sun was setting. I opened it to find my girlfriend, Sarah. She was pale, physically shaking, clutching a bundle of thick hospital blankets to her chest. We had hidden her pregnancy out of pure terror. We were stupid, scared kids living in a community that didn't tolerate mistakes. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, handed the heavy bundle to me, and said she couldn't do this. Her parents were sending her away to live with her aunt in another state. She turned around, walked down the driveway, and got into a waiting car. I never saw her again. I stood in my own hallway for what felt like an eternity, holding a tiny, fragile human being. Noah. He was so incredibly small, his little chest rising and falling against my arms. I could smell baby powder and rain. I walked slowly into the living room where my parents, Arthur and Eleanor, were relaxing. My father was reading a golf magazine. My mother was watching a home improvement show. My older brother Julian was lounging in the armchair, scrolling through his phone. Julian was the undisputed golden child. Varsity quarterback, honor roll student, destined for an Ivy League university. He had the charm, the looks, and the complete financial backing of my parents. I was just the younger brother, the quiet kid, the one who never measured up to their impossible standards. I stood between the television and the coffee table. I took a deep breath that rattled in my chest, and I explained the situation. The silence that fell over that room was heavy, suffocating, terrifying. The television hummed in the background. My mother didn't gasp. My father didn't stand up to comfort his panicked teenage son. They just stared at the bundle in my arms, as if it were a bomb about to detonate and ruin their perfect upholstery. My father finally spoke. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth. He slowly closed his magazine, set it down, and told me to call Child Protective Services immediately. He didn't suggest it. He ordered it. He said we were a respectable family. He said he was up for a promotion at his corporate firm, and my mother was head of the neighborhood committee. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I will not let your massive, disgusting mistake derail Julian's college prospects, or taint the family name at the country club." I looked at my mother. I desperately expected her to intervene, to show a single ounce of maternal instinct. Instead, she stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from her designer slacks, walked right past me without making eye contact, and went straight to my bedroom. I followed her, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stood in the doorway and watched in horror as she pulled a cheap, dusty canvas suitcase from the top shelf of my closet. She unzipped it with a loud, aggressive sound. She didn't fold anything. She just started grabbing handfuls of my jeans, my t-shirts, my socks, and shoving them violently into the bag. It was as if she was clearing out the belongings of a dead person. I asked her what she was doing. My voice cracked. I pleaded. She didn't answer. She zipped the bag shut, dragged its wheels across the hardwood floor, and set it down by the heavy oak front door. My father stepped right into my personal space. I could smell expensive scotch on his breath. He pointed a rigid finger at the door. He told me I had exactly one choice: hand the baby over to authorities tomorrow morning and stay under his roof, or keep the baby and get out of his house right now. He said if I walked out that door, I was dead to him. I looked down at Noah. He shifted in his blankets, completely unaware that his entire existence, his right to have a family, was currently on trial in a sterile suburban living room. I felt a surge of something hot and sharp rising in my chest. A fierce, absolute, primal need to protect this child. It eclipsed my fear. It eclipsed my desperate need for approval. I looked my father directly in the eye. I didn't blink. I picked up the heavy canvas suitcase with my free hand. I didn't say a single word. I reached for the brass handle, turned it, and opened the front door. It was raining heavily. The wind was biting. The door slammed shut behind me with a heavy thud. I heard the deadbolt click into place. I stood on the concrete porch, shivering violently, with a newborn baby pressed tightly against my chest, and a suitcase at my feet. I had no money, no car keys, a cell phone with a dying battery, and absolutely no plan. I just started walking into the dark, stepping off the manicured lawn and onto the wet pavement. I didn't look back at the warm windows of the house. I knew with absolute certainty that building behind me was no longer a home. It was just an empty structure, filled with strangers who shared my last name. The worst part wasn't the freezing rain soaking through my jacket. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion. It was the crushing realization that my own parents found me entirely disposable. They threw me away to protect their social standing. But as the bitter cold seeped into my bones, I pulled the blankets tighter around my son and made a silent vow. I promised the tiny boy in my arms that I would never, ever make him feel the way my parents had just made me feel. I would build a fortress for him, even if I had to build it with my bare, bleeding hands. I thought the worst part of my life was over. I was so incredibly wrong. I walked for over an hour and a half through the relentless downpour. My canvas sneakers were completely soaked, squishing with every agonizing step. The suitcase felt like it was filled with lead, but I refused to drop it. Every time a car drove past, headlights cutting through the rain and splashing dirty water, I turned my back. I curled my body tightly around Noah, using my own chest and arms as a human shield to keep him dry and warm. The panic was a physical weight in my throat. I was terrified a police cruiser would spot a soaked teenager carrying a baby and arrest me. I had exactly one destination in mind, one desperately thin thread of hope. My grandmother Edith. She lived on the completely opposite side of town, far from the gated communities and country clubs. She was my father's mother, but she was absolutely nothing like him. A quiet, stoic woman who observed everything, spoke very little, and never cared about social status. When I finally reached the steps of her modest, single-story house, my hands were shaking so violently from cold and adrenaline. I could barely knock on the wooden door. I hit the wood with my knuckles. A minute passed. Then, the amber porch light flickered on, casting a warm glow through the rain. The heavy door groaned open. Grandma Edith stood there in her thick, faded flannel robe. She looked at my pale, shivering face. She looked down at the soaked canvas suitcase. Then, she looked at the tiny, quiet bundle clutched against my chest. She didn't gasp in shock. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't yell at me for ruining my life. She simply reached out with her weathered hands, grabbed my freezing arm with surprising, grounding strength, and pulled me inside the hallway. She pushed the door shut, locking the storm out. She immediately walked to the hall closet, pulled out a thick, dry bath towel, and draped it heavily over my shaking shoulders. Then, she walked straight to the kitchen and put the metal kettle on the stove. I stood in her hallway, water dripping from my jeans onto her worn hardwood floor, waiting for the interrogation, waiting for the disappointment. It never came. She returned, handed me a steaming mug of black tea, pointed to the small spare bedroom at the back of the house, and told me to get the baby dry. The next morning, before the sun even fully rose, I heard her car pull out of the driveway. She returned 2 hours later from Walmart. She carried in boxes of formula, stacks of diapers, basic baby outfits, and a cheap but sturdy wooden crib. She knelt on the floor and assembled the crib herself, using a manual screwdriver, ignoring her arthritis. When I finally broke down, sitting on the edge of the spare bed, crying and trying to apologize, trying to explain the horrific things my parents had said, she simply held up her hand. She stopped me mid-sentence. She looked at me with piercing, calm eyes, and said we were not going to waste a single ounce of our energy on people who did not matter. She told me, in a voice that brooked absolutely no argument, that I was staying right here. That morning was the beginning of the hardest decade of my life. I had to drop out of my regular high school. I couldn't sit in a classroom while my son needed diapers. I enrolled in an online GED program. I desperately needed to work. I walked miles, knocking on doors, until I found a job as a dishwasher at a local, rundown diner, owned by a gruff, heavy-set man named Joe. Joe was tough, but he was fair. I worked brutal double shifts, standing over steaming sinks of scalding water, scrubbing plates until the skin on my hands was raw, cracked, and bleeding. I went home smelling like stale fryer grease, old coffee, and bleach every single day. My salary was barely above minimum wage, but every single crumpled dollar bill went straight toward Noah's formula and clothes. Grandma Edith became the pillar of our survival. She took over the maternal role seamlessly. She watched Noah during the day while I scrubbed dishes. When I came home late at night, my back aching, my legs trembling, she would be waiting. She would take Noah from my arms, rock him to sleep, and then walk to the kitchen. She would always return with a plate of warm food covered in foil. She never once complained about the burden. She never once made me feel like I had ruined her peaceful retirement. When Noah turned 3, I looked at him playing with cheap plastic blocks on the worn living room rug, and I decided I wanted more. I refused to wash dishes for the rest of my life. I refused to let my son grow up in poverty. I enrolled in the local community college, taking night classes. Years later, I fought my way into a highly competitive state law school. People always ask, how does a single, broke teenage father manage to get through law school? The answer is not genius. The answer is sheer, unadulterated grit, terrifying desperation, and a grandmother who absolutely refused to let me quit. Every single night, after finishing my shift at the diner, I would sit at Grandma Edith's small, scratched wooden kitchen table. The yellow overhead light bulb buzzed a low, constant hum. I would stack my heavy, expensive law textbooks, spread out my cheap highlighters, and read complex legal precedents until the black words blurred into meaningless shapes. There were countless nights I simply gave out. I fell asleep right there on the hardwood, my face pressed against pages of constitutional law and criminal statutes. Every single time I woke up, usually around 3 o'clock in the morning, I found a soft, heavy gray blanket with frayed edges, draped perfectly over my shoulders. Beside my open textbooks, there was always a fresh, covered cup of chamomile tea. Grandma Edith never woke me up to nag me to go to bed. She just covered me, made sure I was warm, and silently went back to her room. That frayed gray blanket became my literal armor. It meant someone in this cold world was watching over me. It meant I was not fighting this war completely alone. I graduated in the top 10% of my class. I passed the state bar exam on my very first attempt. The afternoon I received the official letter from the State Bar Association. I sat at that exact same kitchen table, held the crisp white paper in my hands, and cried silently until my chest ached. I immediately applied for a position at the district attorney's office. I wanted to be a prosecutor. I wanted to stand in a courtroom and fight for people who had their backs against the wall, people who had no one in their corner, just like I had absolutely no one on that freezing rainy night. The morning of my first day at the DA's office, I put on my first cheap, off-the-rack navy blue suit. I walked into the living room. Grandma Edith was sitting in her usual floral armchair. She looked at me from head to toe. She didn't offer a flowery speech. She just gave me a single, firm nod. That small nod meant more to me than 1,000 standing ovations. I spent the next 15 years aggressively building my career. I worked my way up the rigid hierarchy of the DA's office. I became known in the courthouse corridors as a prosecutor who never backed down, a man who prepared obsessively, someone who could dismantle a high-priced, arrogant defense attorney's argument with brutal, terrifying precision. I put away dangerous people. I demanded justice, and I did it all to secure an unbreakable future for Noah. During all those years, my parents never called. Not a single time. They didn't call when I graduated. They didn't call when I passed the bar. They didn't call on Noah's birthdays or at Thanksgiving. They lived barely 15 miles away in their perfect suburban bubble. But they might as well have lived in another galaxy. I heard through the grapevine that Julian went to his fancy private university, that Arthur and Eleanor paid his massive tuition in full, and that he was living a glamorous, high-flying life in a luxury apartment downtown. I didn't care. I had my real family. I had Noah, and I had Edith. But time is the one opponent you can never defeat in court. As Noah grew taller, stronger, and more brilliant, Grandma Edith grew smaller, frilier, and weaker. Noah was 20 years old now, a bright, deeply compassionate pre-med college student. The roles reversed. He became the one taking care of her. He carried her heavy groceries. He made sure she took her blood pressure medication. He sat on the porch and read historical biographies to her in the golden afternoons. They shared a quiet, profound bond that was incredibly beautiful to witness. Then came the agonizing week the house went entirely silent. Grandma Edith passed away peacefully in her sleep on a crisp Sunday morning. Her heart simply stopped. Noah and I were completely devastated. The anchor of our entire existence was gone. We arranged a small, dignified funeral. A few elderly neighbors attended. Joe from the diner, now walking with a cane, came to pay his respects. My parents did not attend. Julian did not attend. They didn't send a single flower. 3 days after we buried the magnificent woman who saved my life, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Aunt Martha, my father's younger sister. I answered cautiously. She asked how I was doing, but her tone was entirely wrong. Strained, forced, almost investigative. She quickly pivoted, asking probing questions about the house, about whether Edith had left a formal will, and who the executor of the estate was. I kept my answers vague, sensing a trap, and ended the call as quickly as possible. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. I felt a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. The vultures were circling. The very next morning, I walked out to the mailbox and found a thick, certified letter. It was printed on heavy, expensive parchment paper, requesting my immediate presence at the downtown office of Attorney Sterling. He was a highly respected, old-school lawyer who had managed Grandma Edith's legal affairs for as long as I could remember. I drove to his office in the financial district. I assumed it was a routine meeting. I expected to sign paperwork to transfer the deed of her small house into my name. Attorney Sterling's office smelled like old leather, polished mahogany, and decades of legal dust. He was a sharp, meticulous man in his late 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored three-piece suit. He motioned for me to sit down. He pulled out a remarkably thick manila file, set it squarely on his desk, and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses and said, in a very serious tone, that Edith was a profoundly private and strategic woman. I nodded, agreeing completely. Then he slowly slid a multi-page legal document across the desk. I picked it up and looked at the summary page. My breath physically caught in my throat. I blinked rapidly, certain I was misreading the numbers. The document detailed a highly secure, private trust fund. The bottom line balance was $680,000. Attorney Sterling steepled his fingers and explained. Decades ago, my grandmother had inherited a small, ugly piece of commercial real estate in a developing part of the city. Before property values skyrocketed, she quietly sold it and took the cash. Instead of spending a dime, she invested the money in aggressive, high-yield mutual funds. Furthermore, every single month for 20 consecutive years, she deliberately deposited a portion of her own modest retirement pension into this trust. The compound interest, driven by her relentless discipline, had turned a moderate sum into a massive, life-changing safety net. The beneficiaries were explicitly named in ironclad legal terminology. 100% of the funds were to be split equally between exactly two people, Dino and Noah. She built this financial fortress in absolute silence. She watched me working myself to the bone at the diner. She watched me struggling to scrape together enough cash to start Noah's college fund. But she was brilliant. She knew I needed to build my own resilience. She knew that handing a teenager a pile of cash would ruin my drive. She let me fight my own battles. But she secretly built an indestructible floor underneath me, just in case the weight of the world ever made me fall. I drove home from the attorney's office in a complete daze. I walked into the kitchen, sat down at the scratched wooden table, and stared at the grain of the wood. I thought about the frayed gray blanket. I thought about the cold tea. She had given me everything she had, emotionally and financially. That profound peace and gratitude lasted exactly 48 hours. I was in my kitchen on a Thursday evening, chopping vegetables to make dinner for Noah, when my cell phone vibrated violently against the granite counter. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed a number I had deleted from my contacts 2 decades ago, but my memory never forgot it. It was Arthur, my father. I put the chef's knife down. I stared at the screen as it buzzed. I almost let it go straight to voicemail. But my instincts as a seasoned prosecutor kicked in immediately. You never ignore the opposing side. You always want to know exactly what the enemy is planning. I picked up the phone and pressed answer. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer a greeting. I just put the phone to my ear and waited in absolute silence. My father's voice crackled through the speaker. Smooth, incredibly arrogant, devoid of any genuine grief. He didn't offer a single word of condolences for the death of his own mother. He didn't ask how his only grandson Noah was coping. He bypassed every basic human decency and went straight for the throat. He immediately launched into a rehearsed business pitch. He said he had spoken to Aunt Martha. He said he was now fully aware that Edith had left a substantial inheritance. Then he had the absolute, breathtaking audacity to claim that the seed money for the trust was generated from the sale of family real estate, and therefore, by his twisted logic, it rightfully belonged to the collective family, specifically him and Julian. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded a furious rhythm against my ribs. He continued, his tone oozing condescension. He said he understood I might feel entitled to a small, token portion, since I had lived in her house rent-free for years. But the bulk of the liquid assets needed to be transferred to his primary bank account immediately. He casually mentioned that Julian was looking to expand his business portfolio, making massive moves in the tech sector, and desperately needed the capital to secure a new venture. I let him finish his entire, disgusting monologue. I didn't interrupt. When he finally stopped talking, expecting me to immediately submit to his authority, like I was still 16, the silence on the line stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. I finally spoke. I kept my voice incredibly slow, deep, and razor-sharp. I told him that Grandma Edith left a legally binding, meticulously documented trust. I told him the money belonged exclusively to me and Noah. And I told him, with absolute finality, that he and Julian would not see a single, solitary red cent of it, as long as I had breath in my lungs. His voice instantly shifted from smooth arrogance to vicious rage. The polished suburban mask completely slipped. He called me an ungrateful, manipulative parasite. He accused me of emotionally isolating an old, confused woman in her final years, just to cut out her real family. Then he dropped his ultimate threat. He said he had already retained a top-tier civil litigation lawyer. He said they were drafting a lawsuit to contest the validity of the trust, file an emergency injunction to freeze all assets, and force a judge to mandate a total redistribution of the wealth. He threatened to drag my name through the mud in public records and take Grandma Edith's house right out from under me. He laughed a cruel, familiar laugh and said, "You're just a stubborn, uneducated kid who made bad choices, and you're going to lose absolutely everything you think you have." He expected me to panic, to cry, to beg, but as I stood in my kitchen, I felt a dark, freezing cold anger settle deep into my chest. This pathetic man still genuinely thought I was the terrified 16-year-old boy, shivering on his porch in the rain. He had absolutely no idea who he was talking to on the phone. He had no idea what I did for a living. He had no idea how many aggressive, high-priced, Ivy League defense attorneys I absolutely destroyed in courtrooms on a weekly basis. I leaned into the phone. I stripped every ounce of emotion from my voice. I kept my tone dead level, the exact tone I use when I am cross-examining a hostile witness who is lying under oath. I told him that exactly 20 years ago, he shoved my clothes into a garbage bag and kicked me out into a freezing rainstorm to protect his country club image. I told him he could talk to me about fairness and family loyalty when he learned how to be a father. Then I gave him my final, definitive answer. I told him to file his pathetic lawsuit. I told him to bring his high-priced lawyer. I told him I would see him in court, and I would bury him. I ended the call. I didn't throw the phone against the wall. I didn't scream in rage. I simply walked into the living room, sat down on the couch, pulled out a legal pad, and began making a meticulous, methodical list of exactly how I was going to systematically dismantle my family's entire existence. They wanted a legal war over this inheritance. They wanted to steal the only gift my grandmother had sacrificed 20 years to leave for my son. They were about to learn a very painful, very public, and very expensive lesson about the law. The next 3 weeks leading up to the preliminary hearing were a masterclass in relentless, cold-blooded preparation. I didn't panic for a single second. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who don't understand the rules of evidence. I understand evidence better than anything else in this world. I met with attorney Sterling multiple times. He was furious about the frivolous lawsuit. He informed me that my parents had hired a man named Vance, a slick, aggressive civil litigator known for bullying vulnerable families into settlements. Vance officially filed an emergency injunction, claiming undue influence and demanding an immediate freeze on the inheritance. They legally claimed I had manipulated Edith while her mental state was declining, essentially holding her hostage to rewrite the trust. Sterling and I sat in his office and laid out the paper trail. It was magnificent. Grandma Edith was a quiet genius, knowing that her son Arthur was greedy and ruthless. She had taken unprecedented precautions. She had required her primary care physician and a board-certified neurologist to sign a notarized certificate of mental competency. Every single year, she updated the trust parameters. She kept meticulous handwritten ledgers, detailing every deposit, proving the funds came directly from her own pension and the initial real estate sale, none of which Arthur had any legal claim to. The paper trail was absolutely bulletproof. But I'm a prosecutor. Bulletproof defense isn't enough for me. I wanted to go on the absolute offensive. I needed to understand the underlying motive. Why were they so desperate for this specific sum of money right now? My parents had lucrative corporate jobs. Julian supposedly had a wildly successful career. Suing your own son over a grandmother's estate is a messy, expensive, public process. People only do it when they are backed into a corner. I picked up my phone and called Marcus. Marcus is a senior forensic financial investigator who works closely with my department. He's a genius at tracing hidden financial footprints, shell companies, and debt structures. I invited him to my office, handed him a piece of paper with Julian's full legal name, social security number, and last known address. I asked him to do a quiet, entirely legal background check, using public records, credit reports, and civil court filings. Exactly 2 days later, Marcus walked into my office, closed the door behind me, and slid a thick manila folder across my desk. He looked at me, shook his head in disbelief, and sat down. The illusion of the golden child was completely shattered. Julian's flashy, Instagram-perfect lifestyle was a complete and utter mirage, built on a mountain of high-interest debt. According to the records, Julian had recently financed a brand-new custom-ordered Porsche 911 at an astronomical interest rate he couldn't afford. Worse, he had taken out massive unsecured personal loans to fund a tech startup that completely collapsed 6 months ago. In a desperate attempt to recoup his losses, he had dumped the rest of his liquid assets into terrible cryptocurrency trades and lost tens of thousands of dollars overnight. He was currently dodging phone calls from multiple aggressive collection agencies and was realistically less than 60 days away from declaring Chapter 7 bankruptcy. My parents weren't suing me out of a twisted sense of family principle. They were suing me out of sheer, blinding desperation. They needed Grandma Edith's money to bail out their perfect golden son before his financial ruin became public knowledge and humiliated them at their country club. They were perfectly willing to steal my son's college fund to pay off Julian's luxury sports car. The level of disgust I felt was intensely physical. I thanked Marcus, shook his hand, and put the heavy folder directly into my briefcase. The pieces were perfectly aligned on the chessboard. I had the undeniable motive. I had the ironclad evidence. I had the absolute legal and moral high ground. The morning of the court hearing finally arrived. The sky outside my window was clear, bright, and unforgivingly blue. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I drank a glass of cold water. I took a hot shower, letting the steam clear my mind. I walked into my closet and bypassed my everyday work suits. I pulled out my best custom-tailored navy blue suit, the armor I only wore for major felony trials. I tied my crimson silk tie with precise, deliberate movements. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I didn't look like a scared victim. I didn't look like a homeless 16-year-old. I looked like a senior prosecutor, ready to go to work and annihilate the opposition. Noah walked into the kitchen just as I was pouring my first cup of black coffee. He was dressed in a sharp, perfectly fitted charcoal gray suit. He looked incredibly handsome and mature. I poured a second cup, handed it to him, and told him he didn't have to come to the courthouse today. I warned him that family court battles are ugly, toxic, and deeply unpleasant. Noah took a sip of his coffee, looked me dead in the eye, and calmly stated that he was not going to let me face those people alone. He said Grandma Edith would want him there. He possessed her exact brand of quiet, unshakable strength. We drove to the downtown courthouse in comfortable silence. I bypassed the public parking and pulled directly into my reserved spot, in the secure underground lot. As we walked through the heavy glass doors and approached the security checkpoint, the armed guards immediately recognized me. They smiled, nodded respectfully, and waved me through. This was my daily arena. This massive concrete and marble building was where I held the power, where I dictated the terms of reality. We walked side by side down the long, echoing marble corridor toward the family court division. I could feel the familiar, cold adrenaline humming in my veins. As we approached the heavy oak double doors of courtroom 4B, I saw them. My father, Arthur. My mother, Eleanor. My brother, Julian. They were standing in a tight circle with a man wearing a flashy, expensive pinstripe suit, carrying a leather litigation bag. Attorney Vance. My parents looked slightly older, a few more gray hairs, but their posture was exactly the same as it was 20 years ago. Arrogant, entitled, looking down their noses at the world. Julian, however, looked awful. He was sweating, shifting his weight constantly, nervously checking his phone every 5 seconds. The crushing weight of his hidden debt was eating him alive. They were entirely focused on their lawyer and didn't see me approaching. I stopped a few feet away, right at the edge of their peripheral vision. I adjusted my cuffs, took a deep, steadying breath, and prepared to step into the room that would finally, permanently, end 20 years of silence and abuse. The storm was finally here, and I was exactly